All right, so this is a presentation I gave at MPCA last fall, and I was going to give it at PCA in 2 weeks or so, and then they unfortunately, of course, had to cancel. Now, what I'm trying to do with this project is to look not just at professional wrestling fans, in particular professional wrestling fans who are doing certain fan fiction, but I'm also looking at it as a way of understanding how fans react to what the business is putting out. And I'm thinking about how to expand this into a larger book. So if you have any ideas or feedback for me as we're going through this, I could really appreciate hearing from you on that. But I really don't have to explain this to you. I mean, as I said when I gave my opening speech this morning, I'm really interested in that kayfabe aspect, as many of you are as well. And I think it's particularly interesting when we think about the fandom aspects because of that blurring of the lines that professional wrestlers have between being an athlete and being an actor. So being a character and being their real self. And when we come at it from a fan studies perspective, we do, of course, have fans of, musicians and athletes and real people. And then, of course, we have fans of characters and fictional people. And it's interesting to think about then as the professional wrestler existing in that liminal space between those two. And we can then, of course, argue, well, how much does the fan of the athlete or the musician know that real person? But it I think is even more complicated with professional wrestling because you can have people who are reacting to the supposed real person, and then you have people who are reacting to the fictional character. So for example, because we've been talking about Roman Reigns, I don't really care much for his character, but he's a really genuinely nice guy. And I kind of like him as a person. So I then have to negotiate those two things. And it's interesting to think about how fans negotiate all of that. And I'm focusing on two characters in particular that have really come to shape the second or maybe third generation of NXT, at least what NXT is right now, and really kind of apparently helped shape NXT away from just being developmental to being essentially its own brand, maybe the third child and the baby of the family, but definitely its own brand. And Johnny Gargano and Tommaso Ciampa have a very interesting history with NXT. It's one that has spanned now almost 5 years. It was a story that has gone through a lot of different directions, partly through their own control. At least Tommaso Ciampa has been on the Edge and Christian podcast talking about how he did things to help shape the narrative. And it's a story that was supposed to really be done last year or maybe even earlier than that. But injuries have altered it, and now it was supposed to conclude this year, this weekend, probably tonight. And now that isn't happening, and now it's being done on an NXT show on Wednesday. So it's a really interesting story, and it's been called by like Brandon Stroud this huge epic story. And I think part of it is that it is a huge emotional epic story. It's not just like a story of a face and a heel, and that kind of goes back and forth sometimes, but the emotional tenure that the two men are able to put into their characters, into their matches, into their story, kind of pushes it beyond. And that's why I think I am seeing a lot of fan activity around it, because, fandom is really centered on that emotional relationship that you have with your object of affection. And that emotional relationship can then drive you to want to engage in certain activities or engage with other people around that topic. So I actually got started with this because I was a fan of Tommaso and Johnny. I actually got the shirt I'm wearing because of meeting them both at an AAW show here in Chicago. And one day when they were in NXT and they were going through their epic storyline, I just started thinking, I wonder if there are any slash stories about these two. I wonder if anyone is doing what I'm doing in my head, which is putting these two men into an actual loving relationship. So I just started looking, and lo and behold, they were. And that's what I really wanted to start getting into. Because when I did my dissertation, I had this idea of looking at the engagement with media, not just in the encoding, decoding ways that Stuart Hall, David Morley, and then other cultural studies folks have done. I'm not just interested in this idea of ideologies and power. I mean, I am interested in that, but I'm also interested in the fans and how fans make sense of the texts and their objects of affection, but also how they then utilize those texts in some way to, understand, reflect, or challenge their lives and society and culture. I mean, that's where fan studies really got started, was this idea of fans pushing back. So I was looking at this phenomenon of people doing slash fan fiction around Johnny and Tommaso as a way that they were in some way reacting to the emotionality of the storyline, but also reacting to something that, from what I could tell, was not terribly common in professional wrestling, which was the emotionality of these two men and the relationship that they built. So I wanted to see how they were reacting to this unconventional wrestling storyline and using it to maybe even reflect upon professional wrestling as a whole. So really what I'm trying to do is first map that emotional storyline and to go through all of their matches and promos on NXT to understand how their performances have produced this particular storyline. So far this timeline, or this listing, shows those main beats of those stories, from when they were positioned as strangers who were just teamed up with one another, to what's happening right now, where after Tommaso comes back from his neck surgery, for a while it looks like he and Johnny are going to get back together, and then Johnny costs him a championship, and now we're back at the feud because Johnny can't forget what Tommaso did to him. So this has essentially been the up and down roller coaster, the 5 years that we've had with these two men and their story. And what I really find fascinating is when you look at their matches, is the extent to which they touch each other. They are very physical with one another, both in terms of, actually hurting each other, like Tommaso attacking Johnny, but win or lose, it was always Tommaso who was kind of reaching out or engaging with Johnny. They were always embracing one another. They were always very physically close to each other. And this was also reflected in their social media presence and how they portrayed themselves as living together, how Tommaso was in Johnny's wedding party, the whole shtick they did with the glorious bombs, and all of that. They were really creating this story of two men who shared a physical connection and an emotional connection that is not that common in professional wrestling. And so this is what the fans are watching and then relating to. And of course, you have the decoding, or people making sense and reacting to the text, such as how the live crowds are reacting, and those live crowds are meant to then trigger how we should react. And over the course of the story, in coordination with those emotional highs and lows, you'll have the cheers and the boos and the cheers and the boos, and sometimes they'll cheer one person and then they'll cheer the other person. So you have that type of decoding that we see very common when it comes to professional wrestling crowds. But I'm more interested in the fan fiction decoding. And one way you see it is when you have the readers of the fan fiction reacting to each other's work. So you see people not just talking about the work, but talking about the characters and talking about how they react to the characters as NXT is portraying them. I mean, I love the last one here where it says, gosh, I love these two fucked up assholes. I think that's a great encapsulation of the tensions that fans have engaging with this very emotional, up and down roller coaster type of storyline. And then when you start to look specifically for slash stories, stories that can range from, you know, having Johnny and Tommaso as a couple, but as you know, it's kind of like a sweet romantic, you know, they're a married couple, they're comfortable with each other, to having really explicit sex. And what I found in looking at Archive of Our Own, the award-winning AO3, so far I found 60 stories that have some type of relationship between Johnny and Tommaso. And you can see that they have 6 with an explicit rating, 5 with a rape non-con rating, which is interesting. But overall, across all of these stories, they've been read over 30,000 times. So, and I'll admit, I've probably read several of them more than once, not just for academic reasons. So there is a pretty good size audience here reading these. And what's often really interesting is the fact that across these stories, very commonly, Johnny will be portrayed as the sweet, innocent, emotional, feminine, you know, sub-bottom character, whereas Ciampa comes off as the stoic, bitter, pained, aggressive, dominant top who, you know, just needs to be loved so he'll be fixed. That's essentially how they're positioning them. Even as the storyline from NXT changes, that positioning remains relatively common across these stories. That ability for, say, Johnny to be able to redeem Tommaso, but also for Tommaso to be able to bring something more animalistic or more pure out of Johnny. It's really interesting. So along with this, though, in the recoding aspect, we do see the fans doing different things with their stories as a way to react to what NXT is doing. So in one subset of the stories, then, we see them deepening the kayfabe relationship. So they're essentially taking that physical closeness that we see between Johnny and Tommaso in their matches and extending it to the next step by saying, well, they're actually in a true physical relationship where you'll have, for example, in the phone tag episode, they make it explicitly relating to an NXT episode, but they then essentially take you behind the scenes to show you what NXT is not showing you, to basically build on what NXT has created as a homosocial relationship and turn it into a homosexual relationship. And another subset, though, is looking at not necessarily the togetherness and building on the togetherness, but it's looking at how they fell apart and reacting to that and trying to find ways to essentially restore that kayfabe relationship, to bring them back together because they don't like seeing the characters hurt or they don't like seeing them not together anymore. They think that they're no longer happy and that the way they'll be happy is by coming back together through this type of relationship. So what I'm seeing then is essentially this idea of the encoding. What NXT has perhaps created is this homosocial relationship that challenges gender stereotypes. You see two men who are engaging in a physicality that traditionally we do not see men, at least in the United States, engaging in. And what the fans are then decoding are emotional reactions to these emotional story cues. They're picking up on that physicality, on that emotionality that's encoded in that physicality. And then they're recoding it as an exploration of a homosexual relationship, perhaps to explain that non-stereotypical homosocial relationship, but then also to repair the bonds of that broken relationship. So they're actually engaging in a form of not necessarily displacement or anything, but they're looking for a way to explain what perhaps is not making sense, to explain a non-traditional relationship, especially in professional wrestling context, and to fix a homosocial relationship that they really care about for two men that they really care about. So Slash in their fan fiction is giving them the ways to make sense of things. And the recoding then essentially operates as relationship maintenance. It's helping them to see how these two men who were positioned as strangers to each other, to explain why these two strangers suddenly seem to be so close to one another. And to hopefully also work through the tensions built into the storyline to essentially create the ending that they would prefer to see. And it'll be interesting to see what happens then after next week's NXT show when they finally have their confrontation that the last several years have been leading to. And to see how fans react to what NXT essentially puts down as the official way to end that story. So what I'm thinking of doing is in some way doing a book that essentially takes this encoding, decoding, recoding approach to media ecology studies to analyze the business, the text, the fans, and the fans' activity around this narrative, because I'm not sure I can do it all in one journal article, but I think it may also be a way to bring together a more complex approach to media studies that perhaps is useful for the world, or not, I don't know. But that's where I'm at right now. And I'd be really interested to hear your feedback then in terms of, does that work? Is that interesting? Or should I perhaps be thinking of something else? So, Miles is saying he'd read the hell out of that book. Well, I like that. And I think it's really interesting too, because what I really want to add as well is doing interviews with the women or the people. I don't know exactly who it is who's doing the fan fiction writing and then reading. And I'd love to talk with them and get their perspective on the stories too. Yeah, and the real life injuries is complicating again this idea of the kayfabe too. When Tommaso had to go in for his neck surgery, he was the ultimate heel in the company. I remember going to a show wearing my shirt. It was one of the takeovers here in Chicago, and I think I was one of the few people cheering for Tommaso against Johnny. But then when he gets injured, and the WWE puts out those video packages showing him with his wife and his kid, and that's the first time we've ever seen his wife and his kid in the NXT context. It really changed how we were supposed to be positioned to him. So that now he comes back, he's daddy going after Goldie, and now Johnny is the heel. And it's just really fascinating how those real life events then had to change the kayfabe, which changed the story, but I'm not sure it's actually changed the fan fiction all that much yet. That's what I have to look for.